Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending upon where you're watching from. We're very happy to have you all here with us this evening. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and on behalf of our leadership team, Mel Levine, Zev Yaroslavsky, Rabbi Ken Chazen, and Caroline Kelly, I'm very pleased to welcome you to tonight's program. Welcome and thank you to today's guests, Sister Simone Campbell and Andrew Seidel. And thank you to Steve Oken, one of the producers of God and Country, for working with us to bring this great program to you. The name of the movie and the name of tonight's presentation is God and Country, Dictators, Democracy, and Christian Nationalism, which will be released in theaters next weekend. You will hear more about that later. And welcome and thanks, of course, to Pat Morrison, our moderator, who's always generous with her time and smarts. And today we have a real LA story because you're going to see Pat different than you usually do. She's going to be in her car because she was going from the Academy Awards, I guess it was the nominees announcement program on LA's freeways. And of course, between those two distinctly LA events, she got stuck in traffic. So she will be with us, but in a very unique context today. But we know she's great and she'll do terrifically anyway. This week, again, we have two programs. Aside from tonight's program on Wednesday, February 14th from 5 to 6. Pacific time. With us, we once again will welcome the exceptional Susan Glasser of The New Yorker in conversation with Warren Olney. Susan Glasser is an amazing writer who many of you have already heard on our show a couple of times, and she's always extraordinarily perceptive, interesting, and brilliant. Next Wednesday on February 21, we welcome back to America to Crossroads one of our country's preeminent election law and voting rights experts, Rick Hasson. He teaches at my alma mater, the great UCLA Law School, and has published another terrific book about voting rights called A Real Right to Vote, How a Constitutional Amendment Can Safeguard American Democracy. We hope you'll join us then. Links to all of our programs are in the email you get after tonight's program. All of our programs are recorded, and there's a past events button or link in every single email you get. So not to fret, tell your friends if you think it's a great program to watch it. Thousands, by the way, watch these programs after the fact, aside from the thousands that watch them during live presentation. And most of you on this call will already know that, but in order to get a Zoom link for the program, you need to register for the program. This is different from our old system where we used to be able to send everybody the Zoom link who's on our mailing list, but that doesn't happen anymore. So to get the Zoom link, you have to register. Tell your friends that, because I get that question a lot. If you don't register, you don't get the link. Now, please welcome from her car, from I think right off the 5 or the 405, I'm not sure which one, please welcome award-winning broadcast journalist who has a share of not one, but 2 Pulitzer Prizes. She's a longtime LA Times writer and columnist, TV and radio broadcaster, author of 2 terrific books, one about the LA River and one about truth, justice, and the American newspaper. Please welcome Pat Morrison, who will further introduce our guests and lead tonight's discussion. Pat?
Janice, thank you. And thank you to everyone watching. And please, I appreciate your patience in helping us deal with this unusual situation. I was a guest at the luncheon for the Oscar nominees for this year. And I'm certain that once you have heard about this documentary, that you will think next year is the year for me to go to the luncheon for this documentary as a guest of these nominees. So I want to thank them for joining us. Thank you for joining us as well. The documentary is God and Country. My guests are Sister Simone Campbell, a U.S. Presidential Medal winner and a director of a Catholic social justice organization, and Andrew Seidel, who is a journalist and an attorney. Both of them appear in this documentary. He's an executive at Americans United for Separation of Church and State and the author of 2 books on the subject and on Christian nationalism. Thank you both for joining us here today.
Great to be with you. Thanks.
Thank you so much for hosting me. I'm excited.
This was really an eye-opening and a little bit alarming documentary. In spite of all you think you know about the subject, the context, the information that came across, just putting together this long history of how the Christian national movement is at this point a vital juncture in how we're going to be governing this country henceforth, really makes you sit up and take notice. So it's how the origins of the movement came about, and where, more vitally, where it's taking us. So, Mr. Seidel, maybe I can start with you because you've written books on the subject. We think of the evangelical movement as something that 200 some years of history in this country. The religious movement, we have religious foundations, but in the past, at least until the last 50 or 60 years ago, it pretty much kept its hands out of politics. It rendered under Caesar what was Caesar and unto God what was God's. What changed that?
Well, we've seen throughout American history previous waves of Christian nationalism. And you can pinpoint a few like really important waves that have kind of left behind these artifacts and really disfiguring scars in some cases that we're contending with today. So there's actually a wave in the lead up to the Civil War. There's another wave that maybe people are more familiar with in the 1950s, and that's when you get things like "In God We Trust" added to our money. You get "Under God" added to the pledge. We get the National Day of Prayer. We get the National Prayer Breakfast. And the next wave of Christian nationalism that came, that you can pinpoint to a couple different maybe important events, but really Brown versus Board of Education is a big part of it. And then deliberately choosing abortion as a wedge issue to avoid sounding like the racists they were. And you get this wave of Christian nationalism that we're really contending with today. And Donald Trump is kind of the avatar for that. He tapped into this undercurrent of Christian nationalism that had been churning through American politics in a way that we just had not seen in the past and were really not prepared for. And one of the best indicators of a Trump voter in the 2016 election was believing that the United States was founded as a Christian nation. That was one of the best ways to determine whether or not somebody was going to vote for Trump. And that really is one of the core beliefs of Christian nationalism. It's where we get the name for this movement, right? Believing that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, that we're based on Christian principles, and that we've strayed from that foundation, right? That we've gotten away from those godly roots. And then they use the language of return, of getting back to those godly roots, and pointing to the artifacts from those previous waves of Christian nationalism, "Under God" in the pledge, "In God We Trust" on our money, to say, see, we really were founded as a Christian nation. And that is the most recent iteration that we are contending with right now.
Sister Simone, the Jesus that I saw in this documentary bears very little resemblance to the Jesus that I grew up with, the gentle Jesus, meek and mild of Sunday school, where you do good deeds and you help the poor and you help your neighbor. And this is a warrior Jesus that they put a MAGA hat on him in some of their posters. And how is it that this Christianity is so different from the Christianity, the kind of mainstream good neighbor Christianity that people who are Christian in this country grew up with?
Well, I think a big part of it is this grievance that goes with what Andrew was just talking about, this sense that I've been left out and I'm angry about that. And therefore, my faith tells me I'm right, you're wrong, and I'm going to force my faith on you without looking at what actually the Christian faith teaches in terms of caring for the, blessed are the meek, they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those, who hunger and thirst for justice. But it's seen as rather as a personal entitlement. Last summer, I went through the South. I drove through the South and met this one man who kind of came to typify this for me. He found out I was a Catholic sister. Well, that was suspect. But he said that Jesus really wanted our country saved. And that's what he was about that the proper people should be in control, which it goes to the racism issue. And the horror of division, when we're really called to be we the people, this ideal of a communal existence is very spiritually grounded, but it's not based in any faith. And this dislocation between the early image of our nation, the idea that separation of church and state, the federal government shouldn't be controlling churches and shouldn't be recruiting for churches, but that people should bring their values to the communal process. And it's the communal process, I think, that is being lost. This Christian nationalism has no sense of a community that involves all of us. It's just theirs.
So, Andrew, let's step back and talk about how the documentary came about, because there's so many news clips in it, principally the assault on the Capitol on January 6th, that you think, oh, I know all about this because I've seen it. But this gets a larger picture and a deeper picture as well.
Yes, I mean, and to me, that was really, I mean, such a remarkable, terrible day. You know, I told the story, and I don't think this made the cut, but you know, in 2019, I was at the Religion News Writers Association conference, and I was on a panel giving a talk about Christian nationalism in the age of Trump. And I remember saying to this room of 300 religion reporters, I opened by saying, Christian nationalism is an existential threat to a government of the people, for the people, and by the people. And I remember thinking, like, this is a chance to wake up people who should know about this, to write about it and to talk about it and to warn people about what is coming. And the subtitle of my first book is Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American, and I'm ringing this alarm bell, and I'm not getting through. And then like something like 16 months after that happens, January 6th attack occurs, and I like so many people, I'm watching that on TV, from lockdown, from home. And I'm actually, my wife is an attorney who also does church-state separation work. And, I'm walking out to her home office, watching this on my phone. And I think it was on MSNBC online. And I see one of the attackers carry the Christian flag onto the floor of the US Senate. And that, and some of the other things I had seen, just really made it clear to me that this political theology, that this danger to the republic had really finally taken a step too far. And the way that I talked about it in an epilogue to the founding myth is that Christian nationalism, it created the permission structure that gave the insurrectionists the moral and mental license that they needed to attack our government and attempt to overturn a free and fair election. And the evidence for that really is overwhelming. It's indisputable and it's clear. I mean, the attackers told us loudly and repeatedly what they believed and why it justified the attack. I mean, they told us about their Christian nationalism. You mentioned the Jesus portrait with the MAGA hat. Like, that was on parade at January 6th, and it actually had some QAnon iconography on it as well. So there's this sort of swirl of ideologies that they're putting into this. But the thing that we tried to do in the January 6th report that we put out, which I think helped Dan Partland and Rob Reiner when they were putting all that imagery from January 6th together, is show that if we ignore the ideology that justified this attack in the attackers' minds, we are inviting future attacks. And again, that's because Christian nationalism, I really think it is that existential threat to the republic.
The origins of this, of course, you can go back to the Plymouth colony and the Puritan and puritanical founders in that region, in that early sense of what the United States would be as a country that had religion as the functional formation of government. They kicked out one of their own guys, Ralph Williams, or Roger Williams, who went on to found Rhode Island, because he didn't conform to their religious precepts. So there was already a sense of religious purity going on. And the idea that government would interfere with this has been something that the Christian national movement has been pushing, even though, as you point out in the documentary, most people cannot tell you any rights or liberties that they have lost under Democratic presidents, for example. It's just this idea in their heads that this is a danger to their religious freedom.
It is.
Sorry. Maybe, Sister Simone, do you want to go first?
Yes, please.
Well, I was just going to say that it's grievance politics. And so it's feeling I've been left out, and I'll hook that onto anything. And then you put the evangelical thought, which is about individualism, about how I am judged. And so I am going to insist on my place and my choices and my government, and not the idea that it's broader than that. I mean, they missed the founding principle of the United States with us attempting this idea of a diverse society able to come together and govern ourselves in a way that is democratic, where everyone has a voice. And so they missed that lesson in civics, but it's their fear and anger that keeps them driving this individualized, individualistic story.
Andrew, you were going to say?
Yeah, I am, I'm an attorney who's dedicated my life to defending the separation of church and state. So I get excited about this. So I apologize for jumping in there, sister. No,
Oh, go for it. You're more informed than me.
well, I mean, the only reason we have religious freedom in this country is because we have that wall of separation between church and state, right? And that is an American original. It's an American invention. The idea was floating around in the Enlightenment, but it was first implemented in the American experiment. Until then, no other nation had sought to protect the ability of its citizens to think freely by separating religion and government. And to me, this is like something we can actually be proud of, and something we shouldn't undermine with myths about being founded as a Christian nation. And if you look at some of the truly unique and original elements of our Constitution, they're secular, right? Our Constitution was the first to declare that power comes from people, not from gods. So those words at the beginning, we the people, they're poetic, but they're also so much more. Our Constitution was the first governing document not to mention a god or a deity. And it's godless by choice, not by accident. In fact, there were some people in the founding generation who objected to that choice. Our Constitution was the first to ban religious tests for public office in Article 6. And that was the only mention of religion in the original unamended document. And it's a very clear and emphatic statement in a document that's often kind of deliberately vague. It's no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office. No, shall, ever, any. I mean, those are strong, clear words. And there's a whole lot that's wrong with our Constitution, but those secular foundations are what made it unique. And they're genuine contributions, not just to political science and thought, but to all humanity.
The founders saw what happened when you had a state religion allied with a state government or a tyrant or a monarch of any sorts. But how is it that they acquired the political power to be in the position they are now? You talk about the 1960s and 70s, about segregation as being kind of one of the goads that got evangelicals interested in the political sphere. But it seemed that being racist was not a good selling point in the 60s and 70s. And so then they had to come up with another target, another enemy. And it was liberals, it was women, and it was gays, and it was abortion.
And they reframed it so that the prosperity gospel is a big, I think, at least in my experience with working with folks, is a piece of this. That the idea is God gives me good things, and if I'm faithful, and it's me, and so I'm wealthy, and therefore I'm blessed by God, which goes with this idea that if I'm virtuous, then our country becomes a good place, and I control our country because I'm a good person. So the political gets informed by the prosperity gospel, which reinforces an individualism that separates us, so that we're no longer we the people. It's I'm in control. It's who's in control.
So then, Andrew, how does that leverage itself into political power of the kind that we see today? Not just storming the Capitol, but in the people who are elected to serve in the Capitol.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that I think that Sister Simone is voicing here is what we're really talking about and getting at is minority rule. I mean, so conservative white Christian American status as the dominant group in this country is threatened. It has been some time. They're losing the culture wars, which I think is a silly phrase that really masks attacks on human rights. Their benighted ideas and ideology are unpopular. That they are losing the privilege and the deference which they believe they are due. And we know that when a dominant group or a caste in a society feels threatened, that it reacts, or often overreacts, by seeking a way to retain that status. And that is why they're turning to Christian nationalism, to violent insurrection, to tearing down those democratic norms, to these so-called strongmen like Trump and DeSantis. That's why they're weaponizing religious freedom. It's because of equality. And we've got studies that back this up. I go over some of these in American Crusade. Studies actually show that they conflate demographic loss, okay, the changing demographics, shifting demographics where they are less and less the majority, with a threat to their freedom, specifically to their religious freedom. And that tells us that they fundamentally misunderstand religious liberty as privilege. Now we all know that's not true, right? Equality, even when it means the erosion of privilege, is not discrimination. But as we are realizing the values that Sister Simone is talking about, the values implicit in we the people and equal justice under law and these other founding maxims, as we recognize that humans are human and are worthy of rights, conservative like Christian America is dying this slow demographic death and rebelling. And they are raging against the dying of their privilege. And so they've declared war, and they've done all kinds of different things to try to retain that power and privilege and status, from gerrymandering all the way through to capturing the Supreme Court and the majority of the federal court seats. So it's been a long-term crusade, is the word that I use in American Crusade, obviously, that they have been on to kind of retain that status and that power.
So Sister Simone, when we're talking about Christian nationalism, who are these Christians? These are not the people who go to Easter and Christmas services and go to the pancake breakfast. What segment of Christians are these people who are so angry and who are so willing in some cases to take up arms over this?
Well, I think some of them are the ones that go to the pancake breakfast and feel entitled and egg each other on. I mean, when I drove through the South, a bunch of the white folks that I talked to, mostly men, it's interesting, from my perspective, it's really a masculine grievance against being displaced and having lost out. And I met this one guy in a church setting. He was so angry. He was so angry because he'd worked hard and played by the rules, and he hadn't gotten ahead and his kids weren't getting ahead. They had to move back home after college and they couldn't pay their debt. And he was so angry, and he says, "We're not going to take it anymore." And this is in a church setting. So it's not like, oh yeah, the Beatitudes show up, or the care for each other, the generous hearted. This is not that. This is being pissed that I'm losing out and my kids are losing out. So we've got to do it differently. We're taking our country back. He told me.
How do they conflate that with their own religious beliefs? Because it's one thing to say I'm angry, we're taking our country back, and voting or campaigning for candidates, but to conflate that with their religion, how does that work?
Well, for him, it's about family. Family is so important. Family is a faith value. We're taking care of our family. He sees it as an extension of his faith, is to act and to be. I was afraid. I was afraid to ask the question if he thought violence was appropriate because he was so angry. Yeah, I didn't want to.
You were afraid of the answer.
I was afraid of the answer or his reaction, that I would even question it. And so that feeling of being left out and using faith as an inclusion. So because he feels left out, left behind, he claims faith as being the alternative way. And so he's going to fight for inclusion.
And Andrew, that's one of the themes of the documentary, is how willing people are to think of violence as a means to achieve what they want. That in a way, they think they've given up on democracy because democracy has not delivered for them, as Sister Simone just said.
Absolutely. I mean, democracy has led to the erosion of that power and privilege and deference that they believe they are due. And the expansion of democracy, right? Again, recognizing that our fellow humans are humans and worthy of the same rights as us, which they object to because it erodes their power and privilege. Rachel Lazar, who's president at Americans United for Separation of Church and State, often says that the end goal of white Christian nationalism is nothing less than the toppling of our democracy. And she is absolutely right. I mean, the goal of Christian nationalism is to rewrite or redefine the Constitution and our law so that it creates two classes of people. It's, the right kind, right in quotes here, kind of conservative Christian and everybody else, so that, conservative, white, heterosexual, cisgender Christian men become the favored in group that the law protects but doesn't bind. And everybody else is the disfavored out group, the others, which the law binds but doesn't protect. I mean, that is what we're talking about. That is what the end goal is here.
And in fact, I'm sorry, Sister Simone, go ahead.
But for them, that would not be the end of democracy. That would be the appropriate goal of democracy. So they don't see it as corrupting, as destructive. They see it as creating what they're entitled to.
And that's exactly what I mean when I call it a permission structure, right? Because you have to have those mental pathways and those justifications in your own brain to, for instance, attack US Congress and try to stop the peaceful transfer of power for the first time in all of American history, right? You have to believe that you are serving some higher power or some greater good. That's the part that genuinely keeps me up at night.
And so democracy becomes a justification for pretty much anything they want to do. And you combine that with religiosity, and if you feel that your religion justifies what you want to do, you have an impenetrable argument, at least as far as they're concerned, for even violence.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. And I just will add too, we're seeing that backed up in some studies that have been done recently. Robbie Jones at PRRI put out some numbers
What
recently.
is PRRI, please?
Public Religion Research Institute, along with, I believe this was in partnership with Brookings, but don't quote me on that. I mean, he looked at where people fall on the Christian nationalist scale. So when researchers study Christian nationalism, it's not just are you or aren't you, right? It's sort of a scale of how, a spectrum really of how much you align with Christian nationalist beliefs very, very strongly, or not at all. The rejectors like myself and probably Sister Simone, right? And the stronger you are on that, the stronger you go towards that end of the scale of adhering to Christian nationalism, the more willing you are to say that political violence is justified. And the numbers are staggering. I mean, like orders of magnitude more likely to engage in political violence, and that's what we're seeing kind of play out, for instance, on January 6th.
Sister Simone, we see in this documentary the demonizing of the other that Andrew was talking about, and so much of that comes from ignorance, and there's also an ignorance about how the way government works, which maybe we can lay at the feet of the fault of failing of absence of civic classes, but also this mythology about the founding fathers, that they were religious people, that they did have a divine sense of how the government should be run, that God should come first, whatever the cost to the other institutions in this country. How do they exist in this belief system that is so easy to disprove to almost anybody else except believers like this?
Well, I think for many who are in the South, they live in a bifurcated society to begin with. And there's still great segregation. In Mississippi, they still call the segregation academies or the white schools. And then there's the public schools, which are mostly Black. And so they still have this, they live in states where there is a protection of division and separation. And then many states have outlawed the teaching of civics. So they don't know how government works, and they don't see it as value to know how government works. And nobody really studies the founding fathers and know that Thomas Jefferson was not a religious person at all. But what he said was that we should bring the values from our faith to the public square. And that's the source of some of this a value-driven approach to a democracy. But it's not a religious-driven approach to democracy. But folks don't have that and are not interested because it's rooted in their own sense of loss.
So, Andrew, you talk in the documentary. The documentary covers the origin of the group called the Moral Majority of Jerry Falwell. And of course, the joke about the moral majority was always that it was neither one, certainly not a majority. So how is it that the levers of power in this country so often are in the hands of a very small majority of people who you describe as Christian nationalists, and whose agenda is very different from mainstream Americans who may support abortion rights, even in a limited sense, may have no problem with gay and lesbian people, may not want books banned from their kids' libraries?
Well, part of it is that there are some issues with the system that our founders created, right? I mean, we have things like the Electoral College, we have things like the U.S. Senate, which inherently concentrate power in minorities, which, you know, maybe it might be time to relook at from a more democratic perspective. But also because they are taking advantage of those systems and those levers of power, and they're using, for instance, churches to ensure that they've got these really amazing political machines, these networks, to get out the vote. So if you look at, for instance, white evangelicals and their share of the population versus their share of the electorate, their share of the population is declining. Their share of the electorate is staying pretty much the same, usually around 25% of the electorate. So they have really been able to kind of leverage not just the system, but their existing structures to increase their political power. And, you know, I mean, one of the things that really is remarkable that you're getting at is, I mean, this blows my mind, right? They oppose marriage equality, but something like 71% of Americans support it. They want to outlaw abortion, but, you know, as you said, in some way, shape, or form, 85% of Americans think it should be legal. They want a nation of Christians like them. 73% of Americans are more welcoming of some sort of pluralism. And I think that goes back to the why that we are seeing this in the first place. It goes back to that those numbers scare them, right? They're scared of the changing demographics that nuns, right? NONES, that the nuns are on the rise, right? Because a lot Americans are leaving religion behind. We elected our first Black president. We have a Black female vice president. We have marriage equality now, because every day we are closer to racial and gender and LGBTQ equality, and that just again goes back to threatening their status. And so they are willing to do anything to maintain that power and privilege and status. And, you know, again, from capturing the Supreme Court to leveraging whatever power out there they can find. And if not that, and if none of that works, then they're going to turn to violence.
But it's not just, can I just insert one thing?
Yes, please,
Pat,
please.
if that's okay. It's not just promoting their side, it's sabotaging others. And so that one of the nefarious undercutting of minority voting is the souls to the polls, which is common in the African-American community.
Mm-hmm.
So they want to outlaw Sunday voting.
Yep.
Because the way churches get busloads loads of their constituent, you know, their members to go to the polls. Well, if they outlaw Sunday voting, you know, it's just too hard to get people to work the polls then. And it's just really a problem. It's really to undermine a serious count of where people are. So it's not just promoting their own, it's sabotaging others. And that's the part that I find most worrisome.
There's a televangelist in the documentary who says, we don't want everyone to vote.
Absolutely.
The fewer people vote, the more power we have.
Yes. I mean, you know, I'm reminded of a quote, actually. So Leonard Leo is, hopefully that name's familiar to some people here. He's kind of universally recognized.
has been exposing Leonard Leo's contributions to conservative causes and to conservative candidates for judgeships.
Yes, and he's the guy who orchestrated the hostile takeover of the Supreme Court. And there's a former employee who described Leonard Leo's mission like this. Quote, he figured out 20 years ago that conservatives had lost the culture war. Abortion, gay rights, contraception. Conservatives didn't have a chance if public opinion prevailed. So they needed to stack the courts. Okay, so I mean, the reason that this comes to my mind is because you notice the anti-democratic admission and goal that are inherent in that quote, right? If they don't stack the court, the majority is going to rule. Democracy is going to work, right? So that is what they are after in the end. The whole point of the hostile takeover of the court, which is just one branch of this tree that we're talking about, is to subvert the will of the people, to subvert democracy.
And Sister Simone, you see a paradox at virtually every point here. You hear people using the word democracy to justify the overturning of democracy. And you see it even in how people deal with public officials, public figures, that they'll believe religiosity from the people they like, but not from the people they don't. Jimmy Carter, a Southern Baptist, arguably our most religious modern president, was mocked and derided by this faction of
or
Christian
Nancy
voters.
Pelosi, who was a very faithful woman who Sunday participation in the Mass or daily Mass if she can is just really critical to her. But how she got denigrated as, you know, this wild, crazy San Franciscan who was running us into the sea, it's really shocking. But again, it goes back to power. It's not about faith. But let me just add one thing about my beloved church, because it's something that annoys me no end. But it's that Ronald Reagan was part of this analysis of where the levers of power were and how could we shift our nation without doing it majority ruled. But one of the things that he did very smartly was to recruit the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops with invitations to the White House and to power dynamics and to being at the table. And that became a very big allure for the leadership of the U.S. Catholic Church. And that cemented, abortion was not the issue pre-Reagan. And so that cemented the political Catholic Church's political alignment with the anti-abortion crowd. And in doing that, that became single issue politics, but it was out of the conscious effort of the Republicans to recruit and lure the leadership who liked the trappings of power. They liked going to the White House parties, and it was cool. They'd never done that before. We'd always been outcasts. We'd always been immigrants and suspect, but here we became on the inside. And that has, I believe, has really corrupted the Catholic Church and made some Catholics, not a lot, but some Catholics, part of this Christian nationalism.
Well, let's talk for a minute, Andrew, about Roe v. Wade and the Dobbs decision to end Roe nationwide, and how we saw blowback and resistance to that in 2022 in the elections, and whether that'll be the case in 2024. Did this Christian nationalist, whatever you want to call it, force that helped to make that happen, are they stepping into difficult territory? Is it a case of be careful what you wish for, it might come true?
I mean, I think that's certainly how it's playing out, and we're seeing politically it playing out a little bit like that, with some of their tried and true allies backing away from that particular issue. In a way, they are a lot like the dog who kind of caught the car. And there was, in fact, there was something called Project Blitz, which people may or may not really remember, that was an explicitly Christian nationalist push in state legislatures around the country. It was put on by 3 different Christian nationalist groups, including Wall Builders, which is run by a guy named David Barton, who's sort of the granddaddy of Christian nationalist disinformation, right? Like all these myths about the United States being founded as a Christian nation, most of them trace back to this guy. And they when Trump won, and it was clear he won on the backs of this, or that undercurrent of Christian nationalism that I was talking about earlier, right? They scrambled to take advantage of it, and it took them a long time to really get there. So you have Jeff Sessions, who's the Attorney General at the time, eventually putting out this religious freedom memo that tries to institute a lot of changes that they're looking for. But one of the things that Project Blitz did was put together all of this model legislation that anybody in a state legislature or federally around the country could go ahead and start passing and trying to impose this Christian nationalism on the country. And the thing that
like
the
a
reason
plug and play program.
Yes, it's a lot like ALEC, with the conservative sort of legislative group that goes out there doing all of these other kind of conservative stuff. And the reason that it was fascinating and interesting at the time is because they start off with all of this ceremonial stuff, like we're going to have a Bible as History Week, and we're going to recognize that we were founded on the principles and values of the Bible, right? And they build from this sort of ceremonial stuff. And then they had 3 different tiers. And the top tier then was things like discriminating against LGBTQ people, right? And these playbooks still exist. They're out there. Fred Clarkson was the journalist who uncovered them. And you can Google and you'll be able to find them. They're fascinating and horrifying reads at the same time. But the reason I'm pointing it out is because often a lot of the measures that we see that are out there, especially legislatively, are not what they first appear. right? And then you get to the true goal later on, things like overturning Roe versus Wade. And we are seeing a pretty sizable backlash against that, and I certainly hope it will continue. I mean, it's looking like it. All signs point to yes, as the Magic 8 Ball says from time to time.
So we're using the phrase Christian nationalism, but so many of the politicians who may be supporters or sympathizers of this talk about the Judeo-Christian tradition. And I know a lot of our viewers might want to know how Judaism and American Jews figure in this vision that Christian nationalists have of this country when they invoke Judeo-Christianity, but may mean something else. I don't know who would like to start with that.
It's not my lane. I'm going to rely on Andrew for that one.
Okay.
Well, so I'm happy to do it. This is actually, I think it's on the second page of the founding myth. I started to get into this a little bit because, you know, the deeper you get into the Christian nationalist milieu, and as you're studying this, Judeo-Christian and Judeo-Christianity is a really prominent term that they use. And it's a difficult to pin down term because it's pretty much a fabrication, right? And the idea of a single Judeo-Christian tradition is a myth in and of itself. And it's a slippery term because it's political, it's not really scholarly. And the first time that you really see it begin to come into use is after World War II, when Christian exclusivity and a Christian government was a little too threatening, a little too ominous. And so the term starts to gain prominence in the fight against communism, when some religion, any religion, was better than those atheist communists, right? Eisenhower was probably the first president to use the term. There's this story in 1952, he and a Soviet general are chatting, and he's saying that the American form of government has no sense unless it's founded on a deeply religious faith. I don't care what that faith is, as long as it's religious. Most of us say it's the Judeo-Christian concept, right? So this is the Judeo on Judeo-Christian is something of a sop. It's something of a fig leaf that's thrown in to avoid controversy and complaint. And I actually include in the founding myth, I include some really fascinating examples where you can see that, where you can see groups like, for instance, Tony Perkins Family Research Council. In one of these voter outreach campaigns that it's running to try to concentrate that power, they have a Christian voting website, and then they have a Judeo-Christian voting website. And the only difference between the two websites is the Judeo. And you have this one that is just very clearly targeted at the most fervent Christian nationalists, and this one that is just this with the Judeo to be worded a little bit more broadly. So all it is it's this morsel of inclusion that's meant to soften the edge of
It's
an
window dressing.
exclusionary movement. Yes, it's a fig leaf. And there is an interesting element in Christian nationalism where white Christian nationalism, there are serious elements of anti-Semitism within the movement, like very serious and alarming elements. And, you know, anytime I post something on social media, I'm not Jewish, but I feel a lot of that anti-Semitism come my way. I see it in response to any time I post against Christian nationalism, which is the bulk of what I do. But there's also this strange sort of support for Israel. And that is largely to help bring on the end times. It really kind of gets into the end times eschatology, and Trump did a lot for them in this regard. He, moving the embassy to Jerusalem. Mike Pompeo was like a very firm believer in this particular strain of Christian nationalism. So there are what seem to be kind of contradictions within the Christian nationalist, I guess we could call it theology, but when you peel back those layers, it does start to make a little more sense. And if people want to read more about that, Sarah Posner wrote a great article recently on that. Brad Onishi, who wrote a book on his experience called Preparing for War, growing up in a Christian nationalist church and then leaving it, has also written about that. I'd recommend them for people who want to read more on that, because that's the extent of my expertise.
Yes, please.
I'm going to tune in now. I'm going to pose questions from the audience to you, Pat.
Yes, please.
And carry on. Many people, Mary and Lynn and many others, have asked for a clearer definition of what a Christian nationalist is, and whether it's the same as evangelicals, and which Christians are Christian nationalists. And as an adjunct to that, why aren't the non-Christian nationalist churches publicly fired up about the co-optation of their religion by these political right-wing forces.
And you show some of that in the documentary, I know, but Andrew, do you want to start with that?
Sure. I mean, I think they are. First of all, let's start at the end there. There's a group called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. It's run by a couple of friends of mine, and Amanda Tyler, who also helped spearhead that January 6th Christian Nationalist report that we talked about a little bit earlier, that really helped inform, I think, a lot of the documentary. And Andrew Whitehead and Sam Perry, who are two of the sort of foremost researchers and developed that spectrum, that scale of Christian nationalism that I referenced earlier, for their book on the topic called Taking America Back for God. They're both Christians who are deeply opposed to Christian nationalism and part of that group. And that group has a definition that they borrow from Sam and Andrew's work, which is a distinctly theological, sociological definition. And depending on who you talk to in this, you will get different definitions, right? Like, I'm an attorney who's been busy fighting Christian nationalism and Christian nationalists in court for the past, decade and a half. I speak about it publicly, so I have a slightly different definition than the one that they use. I like to say that Christian nationalism is the idea that we're founded as a Christian nation, that we're based on Judeo-Christian beliefs, and that we've strayed from that foundation. You heard me say that earlier. And they use that language of return to justify public policy and try to seize and concentrate power in the here and now.
So I'd like to ask Sister Simone, because she was out and about talking to people and how they saw these divisions and definitions too, to address the questions from our viewers.
I think that, at least what I've encountered in my own reaction, is that this is less about faith and more about politics. It's the nationalist side as opposed to the political side of making this real. And the hard thing is, most of us faith folks, we're a little more pacifist. We try to find ways to get along, talk across difference. I mean, that's my work, is trying to find ways to bridge these gaps. And so I'm not going to go and do battle with Christian nationalism. It seems like, I'd only reinforce them. So how do we find ways of engaging and diffusing it? And that piece, I think, doesn't lend itself well to a real public campaign, that it's more stealth work among churches to try to depolarize, defang, take away the challenges within a church setting. It's hard, but we have to do the politics to make the change. So on the political side, let's make sure that we're engaging the political reality that this is.
Janice, did you have another question?
Yes, there were several questions about the Supreme Court. Mina asks about Justice Barrett, who belongs to a small Christian sect, and whether you're concerned about how she might use her beliefs in making decisions. And then there are other questions, quite a few, asking if you believe that there are Christian nationalists on the U.S. Supreme Court. And that parallel question was, how many Christian nationalists do you believe, or sympathizers with Christian nationalists do you believe are in Congress?
Andrew.
Yeah, lots to unpack there. So if you all remember when Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation hearings were going on, this was for the 7th Circuit, when Senator Feinstein asked her a question and then everything exploded because she said the dogma lives loudly within you. It was an inelegantly phrased question, but that question was actually, or that line of questioning was actually about whether or not Amy Coney Barrett would set aside her personal religious beliefs to decide what the law says. That was the Amy Coney Barrett had co-authored a law review article suggesting that she would not. In fact, attacking another Supreme Court justice's answer to that same question in previous confirmation hearings. And she suggested in that article that she would not, that her religion would take precedence over what the Constitution and the law says. So that line of questioning was actually really, really important. And what it's getting at is, can you uphold your oath of office? Can you, when you don the judicial robes, are you able to set aside yourself and decide what the law truly is? And I have deep reservations about whether or not any of the 6 ultra-conservative justices on our Supreme Court can do that.
And what about members of Congress?
I mean, I think Christian nationalism, and that for that matter, the separation of church and state, really have become a deeply partisan issue, unfortunately. So I think I'm I'm not holding out a whole lot of hope on
We're
that
not
front. There are a
asking
lot-
for numbers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
you know, go ahead.
oh, but the other piece about Congress is that Congress is about, it's about elections and getting elected and convenience. And so I don't see among the conservatives a litmus test about being a Christian nationalist. It doesn't, for the most part, it doesn't get them any place. I mean, in the movie, Marjorie Taylor Greene is going on about it, but that's more press attraction as opposed to political leverage, I think. And so I think in Congress, there's less identification with that until the election comes around. And then there may be electoral identification, but it's not political.
I do want to ask Sister Simone about Donald Trump, because the iconography of Trump as the chosen one, sitting in the Oval Office with Jesus at his shoulder, even images of him being crucified. All of Christianity is about people being sinners, but trying to do better. And yet the leader of this, or the rallying human of this movement, seems to be a man who is imperfect, who's proud of it, his history of adultery, of racist comments, of sexist comments, of crooked dealings in his business. This is about the most imperfect person you could choose. And yet he is now the chosen one as far as Christian nationalism is concerned. How does that happen? How is it justified?
Well, I don't know that it can be justified. I need to say that with the organization that I led, Network, Lobby for Catholic Social Justice, in 2020, we did what we had never done in 50 years, which was take a stand on electoral candidate. And we said no Catholic could vote for Trump and be a faithful Catholic. Because of exactly what you were just saying, Pat, that he's not a leader. He doesn't have moral values. He is opportunistic, takes advantage for his own advantage, not for the country. And so I think the piece that I found in talking to people that is attractive is his anger. His anger touches people, and that it touches their own anger. And so they cheer him on because they feel like finally their anger is being expressed in a public way.
Janice, did you have another question?
Yes, we have lots of questions, great questions. Why doesn't this is probably for Andrew, though maybe not, I don't know. Why doesn't the IRS remove the tax exempt status of churches that get involved in politics?
The Johnson Amendment and the tax exemption and the ban on promoting candidates, which gets regularly defied, I think.
It does. Well, and I mean, it's important to be clear about where the line is, because nothing prevents churches or C3s from getting involved in issues, right? Like Martin Luther King didn't violate any law when he got involved in the civil rights struggle. The problem becomes when they are getting involved in political campaigns themselves and endorsing or opposing a political candidate. That's where the line is, because we don't want charitable donations going to political campaigns, essentially. And there is a very strong attempt to overturn that rule. And I think part of the reason that the IRS is not enforcing it, which we're extrapolating a little bit on that, is that they don't want to invite that legal fight and have the Johnson Amendment itself to overturn Section 107 overturned. I will just, one caveat is that we actually don't know if it's being enforced. Any IRS investigation into that would be completely confidential. The IRS even revoking a C3 status of a house of worship would be confidential. You wouldn't find out about it unless the church or house of worship said something about it, or if they challenged it and that became a court battle, which does seem likely. And historically that has happened. There's a DC Circuit Court opinion on this, Branch Ministries versus Rosati, which says specifically that there is no free speech or religious freedom right to a tax exemption, right? Like, it's okay for the government to attach strings to this valuable tax exemption, and that includes not wading into partisan political campaigns.
Our
And
time is
can
getting
I need to
very,
add a
very
little.
quickly, please.
Okay, I need to add a little piece that our organization was a C4, so we did politics and therefore could take a position for our members opposing the re-election of Trump. So we weren't a
Our
C3.
Yes,
Our
different
time is
roles.
growing short, as you can tell from the fading light here in the car in Los Angeles. But I would like you very quick answers, please, Andrew. If the Christian nationalist agenda were to come to pass, just give us a minute on what this country would look like, how different it would be.
I mean, it would be a country where legally that the conservative white heterosexual Christian men are a privileged favored class and everybody else is second class citizens, where the law protects only them, but they are not bound by that law, and everybody else is bound by the law but entirely unprotected.
And so voting rights would be diminished, women's rights diminished, gay, lesbian.
Yes, I mean,
people of color.
all of that's on the table. I think marriage equality is, I know marriage equality is within their sights, and I'm deeply worried about whether or not that's going to survive the next 3 to 5 years.
And so this documentary, which will be in theaters on February 18th, and I think streaming the following month in March, is God and Country, which lays out exactly this kind of agenda and the means of achieving it. We like to end on an upbeat note, so maybe Sister Simone, you can give us something hopeful to hold on to here.
Well, there are a bunch of people working on this issue, and that's where we need to get involved. I want to lift up our organization, Understanding Us. You can see it at letsunderstand.us. The More in Common is looking at breaking out polarization so that we see it more as a continuum as opposed to an either or, and provide methods for conversation. It is possible to change this, to break down the divide, but we've got to work at it. We all have work to do.
And Andrew?
The proof that one truly believes is in action. Bayard Rustin said that. And my understanding is that JUDJ and CAI have a bunch of volunteer opportunities. So I hope everybody goes and signs up for that. I'd love for you to buy my books or get them from the library, American Crusade and the Founding Myth. And Americans United for Separation of Church and State, AU.org. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit educational and advocacy org. And we bring together people of all religions and none to protect the right of everybody to believe as they want and stop anybody from using their beliefs to harm others. We've been doing that for nearly 75 years. And on the hope front, like, I genuinely do have hope here. And it's because white Christian nationalists are working to privilege the chosen few. So every victory that they notch alienates more people, wakes more people up to the danger, and drives more people away from their ideology and into our arms of wanting to push back against it. So they are creating a feedback loop. Their power-hungry aggression is growing the movement against them, right? So we are working to meet these unmet promises in the US Constitution, the idea that we the people means everyone, means all the people. And as we're marching toward that progress, Christian nationalists are fighting harder against it. They're raging against the dying of their privilege. But I genuinely believe in the end we will win, because they are fighting only for themselves. And where they are selfish, we can be selfless. They want supremacy, we want equality. And that's why in the end, we are going to triumph.
Amen.
Thank you both. Thank you both so much. And while I am not in the light right now, I will tell you, this is a very enlightening documentary, enlightening and unsettling, and I think a must-see for this so important election year. It's in the theaters on February 18th, God and Country, and will be streaming the following month. I want to thank everybody for watching. Apologies for the haphazard presentation of me coming back from this Oscar event. I know you will join us for the upcoming events, which you will see on your screen. Thanks again to JUDJ, everybody who supports this program and appears on it. I'm Pat Morrison. Good night. See you next time.